Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others, and in addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Philip Davis.
Does the Prime Minister agree with me that today we need a blue-collar Conservative budget which cuts taxes for people who work hard, do the right thing and want to get on, stop spending billions of pounds that we don't have on overseas aid, and where we source the cheapest energy for people, helping them with their cost of living, rather than sourcing the greenest energy?
Well, first of all, can I thank my honourable friend for giving me the opportunity to remind people that even before this budget, in 2 weeks' time, there will be a tax cut for 24 million people in our country, as we raise the amount of money you can earn before you pay tax. We will have taken over 2 million people out of tax altogether. We've frozen the council tax, we've cancelled fuel duty increase after fuel duty increase, and we are legislating to put customers on the lowest electricity tariff. And I can also tell him we are not going to carry on with the proposal made by the previous Energy Secretary, which was to put £179 on everybody's bill. We've decided to scrap that.
Mr. Speaker, I want to ask the Prime Minister about the situation in Cyprus. Can the Prime Minister update the House about what is being done to protect the British nationals, including our armed forces, who have deposits in Cypriot banks?
No, the Leader of the Opposition raises an extremely important issue at a very sensitive and difficult time for the Republic of Cyprus. First of all, on the issue of anyone who is in Cyprus because they've been sent there by the British government in the armed forces, in the MOD or the Foreign Office, we've absolutely guaranteed that they won't in any way lose out in terms of their earnings or their savings. That is the first thing to say. We've also made sure that money will be available, which is why a plane with money was sent to Cyprus last night. In terms of British citizens in Cyprus, of whom there are many thousands, of course we cannot insure them against any losses in terms of Cypriot bank accounts, but what we can do is make sure that they get, and they get safely, the pensions and benefits to which they're entitled. We've frozen those payments for the time being until this situation becomes clear, but everyone should know they will get those payments.
Ed Miliband.
Mr. Speaker, on Monday, the City Minister said that the UK government had, and I quote, intelligence about what went on in discussions among the Eurozone members who negotiated the plan. Can the Prime Minister tell us what the government knew in advance and what they said about the plan?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, first of all, as we're not in the euro, we do not join the discussions about Eurozone bailouts. And I think this is important, and it is worth noting that because of the deal I did in Brussels getting us out of the bailout fund, we will not be contributing the otherwise perhaps up to £1 billion that we would be contributing under the previous government's plans. So obviously what we are doing is now waiting to see the action that the Cypriot government and the Euro group will agree, and making sure we do everything to help British citizens in the weeks ahead.
Mr. Ed Miliband.
Mr. Speaker, the point I'd make to the Prime Minister is this isn't just a matter for the Eurozone, but for other European economies, because it goes to trust in the banking system. And I think it should have been obvious to everyone that a sudden levy imposed on ordinary savers would undermine basic trust and confidence in banks. Could he, from the dispatch box, send a clear message that any negotiated bailout that is going to be subsequently agreed with the government of Cyprus needs to rebuild trust in the banking system and not undermine it further?
We've made our views very clear to the Cypriot government. In our view, is when you have a deposit protection scheme, as we have in this country, as all of Europe put in place after the crash of Lehman Brothers, those deposit protection schemes should be respected. That is the whole point. That is why they're there for small savers.
Harriet Baldwin.
The Civil Service Union has chosen today to go on strike, but the country does not seem to have ground to a halt. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that that probably indicates that there is a bit more room to save in terms of public sector spending so that we can clear up Labour's debts and get this country back on track?
Well, I think my honourable friend raises an important point. it is important to recognise that we should do everything we can to save and find efficiencies in public spending in order to help hard-working families and keep their tax bills down. And that is exactly what this government will continue to do.
Dame Joan Ruddock.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On January 9th, the Prime Minister told me there would be no hospital reorganisations unless there was the support of the local GP commissioners, proper public engagement and an evidence base. Will he now admit that not one of those tests is met in the case of Lewisham Hospital, where he proposes to close down half the services and sell off 2/3 of the land to bail out a neighbouring, failing trust? Mr. Speaker, can anyone trust this Prime Minister on the NHS ever again? Ever again?
I have to say to the Honourable Lady that it is worth remembering who set up this PFI deal that has meant that this action has had to be taken. The apology over what is happening at the South London Healthcare Trust should come from the party opposite, because they were responsible for creating this situation. As she knows, £1 million a week is being lost from frontline care. No change is not an option, but under the Health Secretary's plans, he has made sure that Lewisham will retain an A&E with senior medical emergency cover.
Gordon Birtwistle.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today, the FT is just under 6,500. In 2008, it was just under 3,500. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that the real investors in this economy agree with the coalition government's economic policy, contrary to the policies delivered by the party opposite?
Well, my honourable friend makes a good point. It is a very difficult and hard road that we're travelling to turn this economy round after the huge mess that was made by the party opposite. But when we look at the fact that just this morning we can see an extra 131,000 people in work, we are seeing the changes necessary to start the rebuilding of our economy.
Ed Miliband.
Mr. Speaker, last weekend the Foreign Secretary said there was a strong case for lifting or amending the arms embargo on Syria in the months ahead. Given that no decision was taken at the EU Council, does it remain the Prime Minister's intention to seek a relaxation of the EU arms embargo?
First of all, let us look at what we've already achieved in terms of amending the arms embargo, where we specifically asked for it to be changed so that we could give technical support to the opposition. We've achieved that, but the French President and I discussed at the European Council looking for further changes to the arms embargo that will be discussed by foreign affairs ministers this weekend. And the reason for that is twofold. First of all, it sends a peculiar message that the arms embargo still applies pretty much equally to this hateful regime and to the opposition, who we now recognise as a legitimate representative of the Syrian people. And second, the French President is concerned, and I am concerned, that we should not be restricted for months and months ahead when we don't know exactly what could happen in Syria, including the very worrying reports of use of chemical weapons.
Ed Miliband.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the Prime Minister for that answer, and obviously everybody is appalled by the actions of the Assad regime. But he will know that there is not only a lack of unity among Syrian opposition groups, but there is also the known presence of the al-Qaeda-backed terrorist organisation al-Nusra on the ground in Syria. So does the Prime Minister understand the widespread concern that remains about the idea of seeking to supply weapons to the rebels?
I think the Leader of the Opposition puts the point absolutely rightly. There is widespread concern about the nature of the opposition, and the argument I think we have to engage in is this: are we more likely to help the good elements of the opposition by standing back, or are we more likely to help by getting in there and shaping and helping and giving this technical assistance so that we can actually play a part in building up the Syrian opposition so they are a legitimate and credible alternative to this hateful regime? And it is worth recalling, and we should all recall, the fact that current policies are not working for the people of Syria. 70,000 people are dead, and this hateful regime is still in place.
Ed Miliband.
He's absolutely right that the current situation is a terrible terrible situation. We just mustn't make it worse with the actions we take, Mr. Speaker. Now, the UN has said, the spokesman for the UN Secretary General has said that the introduction of more weapons into Syria is, and I quote, counterproductive and will not lead to a solution. Now, Special Representative Brahimi recently called for a renewed diplomatic initiative to bring the warring parties to the negotiating table. Can the Prime Minister set out what steps the UK government specifically is taking to support the UN in advancing this initiative?
Well, we are taking specific steps to help the UN with this vital initiative, and trying to achieve a diplomatic solution with transition at the top of this regime is worthwhile pursuing, and that is why we've had detailed talks with the Russian foreign and defence ministers in the last week. But I would just make one other point about the issue of the arms embargo, because I felt, sitting around the European Council chamber, there was a slight similarity between some of the arguments that were being made about not putting more weapons into Syria that seemed to me very familiar to the discussions we had about Bosnia and the appalling events that followed. And in my view, it is better to be engaged, working with the Syrian opposition and trying to bring this conflict to an end.
Anne-Marie Morris.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Traveller numbers on the coastal railway line running through my constituency of Newton Abbot are growing fast. Given its importance to local tourism in Dawlish and Teignmouth, can the Prime Minister assure me urgent investment plans are in hand to repair recent flood damage and to create a long-term sustainable future for this railway line?
I can give my honourable friend that assurance, and I know that the Transport Secretary will shortly be visiting her constituency. Investment is going into the whole of the line that serves her constituency, including the major investment shortly to be completed at Reading Station, which will help capacity all down the line.
Margaret Ritchie.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister will be aware of the growing disquiet across the UK regarding his government's welfare reform proposals. Great disquiet because these proposals are deeply unfair and will, I predict, lead to administrative chaos. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that in terms of legacy for him, welfare reform will be his poll tax?
I don't agree with the Honourable Lady at all. I find that there is strong support for the housing benefit cap, so we no longer fund homes in the capital of our country up to £100,000 a year. There is strong support for the welfare cap, and indeed there is strong support for universal credit, which will make sure that in every case people are better off in work and are better off when they choose to work extra hours. That is what we want, is a welfare system that supports enterprise, work and aspiration.
Mr. Henry Bellingham.
Is the Prime Minister aware that 7 people have died on Norfolk's roads in the last week? And furthermore, 8 have died on the A47 in the last 10 weeks. Does he share my concern about this tragic loss of life? And is he aware of a campaign that's being run by myself and other honourable colleagues like the Honourable Member for Broadland to improve the A47? Norfolk people understand the current budgetary constraints, but simply want a fairer share of resources.
Well, I'm grateful to my honourable friend for bringing me up to date with this important campaign that he and others are leading in Norfolk. We do have a much better record on road safety than we've had in recent years, but we should never be complacent. We should continue to work on that. I know that money has been made available for road schemes in Norfolk, of course, the A11 chief amongst them. And I can see from the Transport Minister nodding vigorously behind my honourable friend, there may be more to come.
Kathy Jameson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the Prime Minister agree? Does the Prime Minister agree with Lord Heseltine that people are suffering under the recession and that it would be the wrong politics at this time to remove the 50p top rate of tax? And will he now cancel next month's tax cut for millionaires?
The point I would make to the honourable lady is after the start of the financial year, the top rate of tax will be higher than in any year when Labour was in office. And I'm sure that's something that Michael Heseltine would fully agree with.
Mr. David Mowat.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today is the 20th anniversary of the Warrington bombing. The Prime Minister may recall, or will recall, that over 20 were killed and injured, amongst them a 12-year-old boy, Tim Parry. Will he join me in congratulating Tim's parents, Wendy and Colin, for the way they have worked tirelessly for peace over the last 2 decades, in particular the establishment of the Foundation for Peace, which brings help to victims of conflict around the world?
I certainly join my honourable friend in praising that family for the incredible bravery that they have shown. When you suffer a tragedy like this, it must be so much easier to try to put it behind you and forget about it, but to go on and campaign for peace and to bring together the people of Warrington as they've done, I think shows enormous character and fortitude, and they have the backing of the whole country.
Jonathan Ashworth.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Has the Prime Minister had time to consider the remarks of his leader of the MEPs in the European Parliament, who has said of the decision to cut the 50p rate that it was, and I quote, one of the biggest mistakes we've made so far in this Parliament, and disastrous to do so in a recession? Is Mr. Callanan right or wrong?
Well, the point I'd make to the honourable gentleman is that when his party put the top rate of tax up, millionaires paid £7 billion less in taxation. So we're having a lower tax rate that will raise more revenue. That makes pretty good sense.
Paul Uppel.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just a few weeks back, my right honourable friend became the first serving British Prime Minister to visit Amritsar in Punjab. As a British Sikh, can I actually say how warmly this visit was received? But more importantly, would my right honourable friend congratulate Her Majesty's government on the pioneering work they've done in searching the Sikh turban at European airports? This actually shows you can actually have a proactive relationship with Europe rather than a reactive one.
Can I thank my honourable friend for all the work he does in this area and for the way that he consistently raises issues about the British Sikh community, the immense contribution they make to our country and the respect that we should show them. Can I also thank him for accompanying me on that trip to the Golden Temple, something I will never forget. And it is an opportunity to say on behalf of everyone in this House how much British Sikhs give to Britain and how much we thank them for it.
Chion Wura.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituent, Jordan Kingsland, found himself homeless, aged just 17. He was offered social housing and is now studying for his A-levels, determined to improve his situation through education. From his £56 weekly benefit, he will lose £14 in the bedroom tax and £3 in council tax, leaving just £11 per week to live on after utilities. So based on the Prime Minister's experience of hardship, what advice does he have for Jordan?
Well, the point I would make to the honourable lady is, first of all, this government is investing in social housing, and she'll hear more about that in a moment or two. The second point I would make is that when housing benefit costs £23 billion a year, we simply have to reform it. And there is a basic issue of fairness, which is why should someone who's living in private rented accommodation not receive a spare room subsidy when someone who is in social housing should? There is a basic issue of fairness, and that is why it should be put right.
Laurelie Burt.
Unlike the honourable member for Shipley, I'm very proud of our coalition for sticking to the 0.7% aid target.
The honourable lady's question must be heard. People shouldn't jeer before they've heard. Laurelie Burt.
Speaker, we set an example to the world, and later on this month, the Prime Minister goes to Bali to co-chair the high-level panel to discuss the next set of Millennium Development Goals. Will he use his leadership to press for a standalone goal on gender equality and women's empowerment?
Well, I will look very carefully at what the honourable lady says about the importance of gender equality in terms of the new Millennium Development Goals. The point I would make to anyone who raises the issue about our aid commitment is I don't think we should break our promises to the poorest people in the world. And when you think about it, our key aim ought to be to eradicate the extreme poverty people sometimes still face, living on less than $1.25 a day. That is what we're talking about, and I think we should be proud of the fact we're keeping our promises.
Diana Johnson.
Mr. Speaker, as a money-saving tip on budget day, and in line with what the Education Secretary wants for teachers, could the Prime Minister put his Chancellor and the Cabinet on performance-related pay? And how much does he think it would save?
It is this Chancellor that has seen the deficit come down by a third since he became Chancellor and has seen over 1 million private sector jobs. He is getting the country out of the hole that we were left in by the party opposite.
Mr. Richard Fuller.
Speaker, will the Prime Minister
welcome the successful launch in Bedford last week of the country's first local enterprise fund, where people who care about Bedford have raised £400,000 to invest in businesses in Bedford, encouraging enterprise and securing employment. And will you agree with me that in this respect, as in so many others, where Bedford leads, the rest of the country should follow?
I'm sure my honourable friend is right about Bedford's leadership in all things, but he makes an important point, which is we do need to see more small businesses start, more enterprise, and we have seen in Britain over the last 3 years the fastest rate of new business creation in our history, but we need to see more of it to keep the private sector going.
Alex Cunningham.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Rising unemployment remains an issue in my Stockton North constituency. Is unemployment and recession, which grinds hard-working families and the most vulnerable into the ground, a price worth paying for next month's obscene tax cut for millionaires?
If the honourable gentleman actually looks at the figures today, he'll see that there are 131,000 more people in work over the last quarter. We've seen 600,000 more people employed compared with a year ago. That is what is actually happening in terms of employment. And I have to say, when we look at the mess we were left by the party opposite, being given advice on economics on budget day from the party opposite is like asking Enron for accountancy advice.
Marcus Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In less than a fortnight's time, this government will have taken 3,168 of my constituents out of paying income tax altogether. Not show that this Conservative-led government are on the side of hard-working, low-paid people.
Well, I think my honourable friend makes an important point, is that we have consistently lifted the personal tax allowance, the amount of money that you earn before you start paying tax, starting at around £6,000 and now rising all the time. So over 2 million people have already been taken out of tax altogether, and if he's sitting comfortably for the next half an hour, he may have some further news.
Bridget Phillipson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the Prime Minister agree with his honourable friend, the member for Hexham, that his government's focus should be on looking after people who are struggling to pay their mortgages rather than protecting those in £2 million houses?
Well, we should be helping people who are paying their mortgages, and that is why it's so vital that we stick to our plans, because we have low interest rates in this country, because we have a plan to get the deficit down. That is absolutely key. The other point I would make to the honourable lady is, if you look at the funding for lending scheme from the Bank of England, that has now successfully reduced mortgage rates, and it's also made sure that people who don't have access to a large deposit are able to look at buying a house. We are making progress, but there's a lot more to do.
Gavin Williamson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This month, we have had the wonderful news that Jaguar Land Rover are going to create a further 700 jobs in South Staffordshire, bringing their total investment to over £500 million. Last year, we saw the creation of 70,000 manufacturing jobs in the UK. Does my right honourable friend not think this is stark contrast to the 1.7 million manufacturing jobs destroyed under the last Labour government?
My honourable friend makes an important point. Jaguar Land Rover has been a massive success story for our country, and I would praise all of those who have invested money in that business, and all those who work in that business, and all the apprenticeships who are being trained in that business. It is part of a recovery of our automotive sector that has, for the first time in 30 years, seen a surplus in the number of cars that we export overseas, and is part of a picture where Nissan, Toyota, Honda, other automotive businesses in this sector are doing well, and we support them.
Tom Greatrix.
Very much, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister will be aware that this week marks the bicentenary of the birth of Dr. David Livingstone, born in Blantyre in my constituency, buried in Westminster Abbey, marked by a service attended by President Joyce Banda last night in the Abbey. He will know that one of Livingstone's proudest achievements was the drive to abolish slavery in East Africa. Given the bicentenary, does the Prime Minister agree with me that it's a time for his government to now take the lead to end the scandal of the 2.5 million people in modern-day slavery or prostitution as a result of people trafficking?
I think the honourable gentleman makes an important point, and it gives me the opportunity to praise President Banda for her work and for what she's doing to lift people out of poverty in Malawi, and to thank her for visiting Britain and for visiting Scotland this week. I think he makes an important point about slavery, because there is still modern-day slavery, and we still need to take action in order to combat it, and that is action at a European level, action at a national level, and at a local level with the police. And this government will continue to take that action.
Duncan Hames.
Whatever further changes the Chancellor announces today, next month payslips of millions of ordinary working people will show a tax cut from the personal allowance rise Liberal Democrats called for. The largest single change to income tax in this Parliament. What does this say about the priorities of his coalition government?
Well, this is an important priority that we have taken action on in budget after budget, even in difficult times, saying to people, we are on your side, we want to cut your tax bills, and in just 2 weeks' time there will be a tax cut of over £200 for 24 million people in our country, each and every taxpayer, and at the same time lifting over 2 million people out of tax so they don't pay any income tax at all. It is real progress, and it's on the side of people who work hard and want to get on.
Gloria De Piero.
What is the Prime Minister planning to spend his millionaires' tax cut on?
The point I make to the Honourable Lady is that when the top rate of tax was put up, millionaires paid £7 billion less. That is the sort of incompetence and inefficiency that she left the sofa of GMTV to support.
Order, the question is asked. Members shouldn't shout their heads off when the Prime Minister is giving an answer. Dr. Julian Lewis.
Given that SAS Sergeant Danny Nightingale has had his conviction quashed following the quashing of his military prison sentence last year, does the Prime Minister agree with me that it would be totally against the public interest and against the interests of the SAS regiment for him to have to face a fresh trial when others are benefiting from the weapons amnesty rightly introduced by the Secretary of State for Defence as a result of the Nightingale case?
Well, my honourable friend raises an important point, and let me say how strongly I support all of those who serve in our special forces. You get the privilege as Prime Minister of meeting many of these brave people and seeing they are some of the finest and most courageous people in our country. But I don't want to get in any trouble with my right honourable friend, the Attorney General, so I'll leave the issues for the courts to the courts.
Hugh Bailey.
Money the government has set aside to help people who are hit by the bedroom tax won't cover a fraction of the really hard cases, like that of my paralysed constituent who receives round-the-clock care from his wife. There's an acute housing shortage in York and they have nowhere to move to. So will the Prime Minister do one more U-turn on the bedroom tax and scrap it altogether?
Well, first of all, let me just remind the honourable gentleman that only the Labour Party could call a welfare reform a tax. It shows how little they understand about how tax and benefit actually work. What we are doing is making available a discretionary fund, which is there for the hard cases, but recognising there's a basic issue of cost, about 23 billion spent on housing benefit every year, and there's a basic issue of fairness, not just fairness between the private sector and the social sector, but also recognising there are 1.8 million people on housing waiting lists who would love to have a bedroom.
Mr. Ian Stewart.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Is my right honourable friend aware that the Business Location Index has just voted Milton Keynes as the best place in the country to do business? And with over 2,000 business start-ups in the last year, it is Milton Keynes that is rebuilding our economy.
No, well, I was aware of that statistic because he helpfully reminded me of it when we were in Milton Keynes together very recently, talking about exactly this issue, what a fantastic location for business it is, how it is encouraging business start-ups, and it is leading to a growth in employment in that region.
Ronald.
Mr. Speaker, given that the Chancellor has this morning joined Twitter, could the Prime Minister remind the Chancellor and the House what too many tweets make? I
I've made a number of remarks about Twitter over the years, most of which I've had to withdraw because I am now tweeting myself. But I look forward to the first tweet after the budget this afternoon. But what is clear is he could tweet even now that we are cutting taxes in 2 weeks' time for 24 million working people, taking 2 million people out of tax. And certainly tweeting that would not cause any dangers for him.
Shailesh Vara.
Recently, the Shadow Home Secretary admitted that when Labour were in government, they got their immigration policy wrong. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that across the breakfast table, she should persuade her husband to make a similar admission as far as Labour's economic policy is concerned?
I think my honourable friend makes a very good point. We inherited a complete shambles when it came to immigration, a system completely out of control. But we still have, and we've had apologies, or sort of apologies for that. What we haven't had is any sort of apology for the borrowing, the spending and the debt for the mess that we were left in by the party opposite.
Caroline Lucas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's been estimated that for the cost of just one nuclear reactor, 7 million households could be lifted out of fuel poverty through energy efficiency and conservation. Hinkley is expected to come with an eye-watering £14 billion price tag and a strike price getting on for double the price of current electricity. If that doesn't make nuclear unaffordable, can the Prime Minister tell us what would?
Well, I'm afraid I just don't agree with the Honourable Lady. Our fleet of nuclear power stations are coming to the end of their life, and I think it's very important that we work hard to replace some of that capacity. That is what Hinkley is about. That is why I think my right honourable friend was absolutely right to give it the go-ahead, and I think it's going to be an important provider of carbon-free electricity in the years ahead.
Order.